Hello everyone. Micah 5:2. This video concerns a false claim made by Trinitarian apologists concerning this verse. You don't see them promoting this verse as much as they used to, or appealing to this verse. Not sure why. I think it's because of some of the newer translations that are out there. But quite often you'll still see people cherry pick the King James translation and appeal to this verse to try and claim that Jesus is actually the eternal God, the Son, from eternity past. So let's just read the King James Version translation of Micah 5:2. But thou, Bethlehem Ephratah, hard to pronounce that one, though thou be little among the thousands of Judah, yet out of thee shall he come forth unto me that is to be ruler in Israel, whose going forths have been from of old, from everlasting. So they hone in on those words, from of old, from of everlasting, and the words goings forth. And the Trinitarian claims that Christ is from eternity past. And this verse refers to the pre-incarnate God the Son who existed before creation. Now we'll see here in a minute that the word Bethlehem is kind of the key word in this passage. And this verse is cited at Matthew 2:4-6 by the chief priests. And Herod hears that the Magi are looking for this child that has been born, King of the Jews. And that doesn't sound good to Herod, who is king of the Jews. And so he inquires of the chief priests and scribes of where this king of the Jews is to be born. And they said to him, in Bethlehem of Judea, for this is what has been written by the prophet, and you, Bethlehem, land of Judah, are not the least among the leaders of Judah, for out of you shall come forth a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. Matthew 2:4-6. And it's sort of abbreviated here a bit. That very last part where it says, who will shepherd my people Israel, actually comes from Micah 5:4, verse 4. And again, we see the same idea in these two verses. Has not the scripture said that the Christ comes from the seed of David and from Bethlehem, the village where David was? The seed of David and from Bethlehem. These are really the key words in question concerning Micah 5:2. Joseph also went up from Galilee, from the city of Nazareth, to Judea, to the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and family of David. And then it goes on to say in verse 11, for today in the city of David there has been born for you a Savior who is Christ the Lord. So the Trinitarian claim is heavily based on these words here in bold, whose goings forth are from everlasting. And so Trinitarians imagine that this means Christ came, he originated in eternity past. But they somehow want to interpret this passage to mean that Christ is from eternity past. Therefore, this refers to the pre-incarnate Christ who is God the Son. That's basically the idea. Whose goings forth from everlasting. However, if you start to compare other translations, you'll see that there's a very significant problem with this Trinitarian claim, and you'll see why they want to cherry pick the King James Version or some version that's similar to the King James. Look at all these other translations, translated by Trinitarians, generally speaking here, whose coming forth is from old, from ancient days. ESV, whose origins are in the distant past. The Net Bible, New English Translation, whose origin is from old, from ancient times, whose origins are from of old, from ancient times, NIV, whose origin is from old, from ancient days, NRSV, whose origin is from old, from ancient days, RSV, and whose comings forth are of old, from the days of antiquity, Young's Literal. But nothing here suggests the Messiah existed in eternity past, if you read these translations. So straight away, just by looking at some other translations, we can see there's a very big problem with this Trinitarian claim concerning Micah 5:2. And so what I've done here is I've bolded the differences in these translations compared to the KJV, where they have goings forth. Other translations will have coming forth or comings forth, or origin or origins. Where they have everlasting, other translations have ancient days, distant past, ancient times, days of antiquity, etc. And if you went with the King James idea, it would literally say days of eternity, which is an absurdity in itself, because eternity is timelessness. There's no time before time began. It's not never-ending time in eternity past, it's timelessness, outside of time. But they just kind of obliterate the word days in the King James translation and just translate it as everlasting. So here's the word that the King James translates as everlasting in some other verses. Remember the days of old. Consider the years of all your generations. Ask your father and he will inform you, your elders and they will tell you. Well, how is your elders going to tell you about eternity? Remember the days of eternity. Ask your elders about eternity. That's not going to work. Or Joshua 24:2, from ancient times your fathers lived beyond the river. From eternity, your fathers lived beyond the river. You see the problem there? If you're insisting that this word means eternity past or something like that. They were the inhabitants of the land from ancient times. They were inhabitants of the land from eternity. Remove not the ancient landmark which your fathers have set. Remove not the eternal landmark. I don't think so. It's not going to work. And that's why you see these translations as opposed to the King James translation. They can see what's really going on here with this word. It doesn't mean eternity. But the big question at hand here is, what's the point in this passage? What is this verse telling us? What's the intention? Why is it using this language? And what are we being told here? And if you keep reading, you'll see it goes on to say, Therefore he will give them up until the time when she who is in labor has borne a child. Then the remainder of his brethren will return to the sons of Israel, and he shall arise and shepherd the flock in the strength of Yahweh, in the majesty of the name of Yahweh his God. It's referring to the Messiah, God's anointed one. And Yahweh is the God of his anointed one, his Christ, his Messiah. And that's what this verse is about. Bethlehem was the city of David because it is the hometown of David and Jesse, his father. The coming Messiah would be a son of David and born in the little town of Bethlehem, the hometown of his forefather David. All of this stuff revolves around God's promise to David at 2 Samuel 7:11-14, where God promises David that his descendant would sit on this kingly throne forever. And in the New Testament and in Jesus' death and resurrection, we see how this promise is fulfilled. In fact, Luke mentions it, at the time of Jesus' birth, that God will give to him the throne of his father David. And that's why all this talk here at Micah 5:2 surrounds the idea that the Messiah will be the son of David. It's all based on God's promise to David at 2 Samuel 7. Very, very important promise to first century Israelites. And that's how they knew that the coming Messiah was a son of David, because of God's promise to David. And that's why we see that this passage is about Bethlehem. Okay? And what it's talking about, and we'll see it clearer in a minute, is the ancient ancestral origins of the human being, Jesus. The city of David, Bethlehem. Jesus is the Messiah. He's the son of David, and David's hometown is Bethlehem. Bethlehem is the hometown of the house of David. And that's the whole point here. And I'm not going to read all this through, but if you want to pause it and read it, this is where you can start to see this. And this is where we see in the Bible that Jesse and his son David are from Bethlehem. At Ruth chapter 4. And then other passages in the Old Testament, refer to the fact that Jesse is from Bethlehem. And David is the son of Jesse from Bethlehem. 1 Samuel 16:1, 1 Samuel 7:12. And again, Joseph also went up from Galilee, from the city of Nazareth to Judea, to the city of David, which is called Bethlehem. So when it says his origins are from ancient times, from the days of old, it's talking about the fact that the Messiah was a son of David. His genealogy, his human ancestral genealogy, was that he was a son of David, whose hometown is Bethlehem. And so the Messiah's ancestral origins trace back to ancient times, from the time of Jesus' birth. And David lived here in Bethlehem 1,000 years before Jesus was born. Very long time ago. Not from our perspective, but from the perspective of the time Jesus was born. It's 1,000 years before he was born. In the old days. And that's why we see this. When they are asked where the Messiah is to be born, they point to this verse, because they know that the Messiah is a son of David and will be born in the city of David, Bethlehem, the hometown of the house of David. Bethlehem. So when you just digest all those facts and sort them out in your mind, you'll see that this verse refers to the Davidic human ancestry of the Messiah. It's sort of just saying the opposite of what Trinitarians are claiming. It's not referring to, God the Son in eternity past. It's referring to the ancient ancestral origins of the Messiah. Jesus, the Messiah, had his ancient ancestral origins in Bethlehem, where David was born. As prophesied, the Christ will be a son of David. Very important thing in the New Testament scriptures. It's just sort of an incidental thing in the minds of Trinitarians that Jesus was a son of David. But it's a huge prophecy that's being fulfilled. The Christ will be a son of David, and the ancient hometown of the house of David is Bethlehem. And this passage tells us that David's descendant will be born in Bethlehem, where David was born in the days of old, 1,000 years before Jesus. 1,000 years is ancient even to a first century Jew. A Jew. That's a long time ago. And because of God's promise to David and their expectation that the son of David that God promised is the coming Messiah, and vice versa. The coming Messiah is the son of David. These chief priests, when they answered Herod, they knew that the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem, because the scriptures said so. And that's the whole point of this verse at Micah 5:2, as interpreted by the chief priests at Matthew chapter 2. And the Messiah is God's Messiah, God's anointed one, God's Christ. God's Christ, by definition from the Old Testament, David was God's Christ, is the King of Israel. And that's what this question was by Herod to the chief priests. The King of the Jews was by definition God's Christ. He's anointed to be King of the Jews. And when asked where this King of the Jews was to be born, this Christ, because the two are understood to be one and the same, they point to Micah 5:2. Because his ancestral origins are the city of David, his forefather. And that's because the coming Messiah is a son of David. God bless you.